The Man Who Never Was, Operation Mincemeat. The year is 1943. The world has been at war for 3 winters, and the cold of this one feels deeper than the last. It is a cold that lives in the bones, a cold that not even the weak tea, endlessly brewed, can seem to touch. In London, the nights are defined by their sound, or rather, their lack of it. There is the sound of the rain, a constant, whispering hush against the blacked-out windows. There is the damp, mineral smell of the tube stations, where thousands sleep, and sometimes far away, there is the low, mournful siren that rises and falls like the breath of a sleeping beast. But mostly, there is the silence. Deep beneath the ground, under the steady feet of Admiralty Arch, lies a room. It is not a grand room. It is a concrete basement, known to only a handful of people as Room 13. It smells of damp concrete, of stale cigarette smoke, and of paper. Mountains of paper. In this room, the only light comes from a single, green-shaded desk lamp. It casts a small, bright circle on a vast map of Europe. The map is a geography of impossibility, from the frozen fjords of Norway, down the granite coast of France, and all along the warm blue curve of the Mediterranean. The continent is a fortress. And in this small circle of light, 2 men are leaning over the map, lost in the silence. Their names are Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley. They are not soldiers, not in the way the world pictures them. They do not carry guns. They do not wear the rough wool of the infantry. They wear suits, slightly rumpled, their ties loosened. Montague is a barrister in peacetime, a man whose mind is a library of logic and persuasion. Cholmondeley is an academic, an eccentric, a man who sees the world in pathways that others do not. They are, in essence, dreamers, and their job in this cold, quiet room is to dream a lie. The problem they face is the map itself. The war has reached a terrible, grinding stalemate. The Allies must re-enter Europe. They must break the fortress. To do so, they must land an army. And the only logical, obvious, and necessary place to do it is the island of Sicily. It is the soft underbelly. It is the perfect target. And that, precisely, is the problem. The Germans are not fools. They can read a map just as well as the men in Room 13. They know Sicily is the target, and so they are waiting. At this very moment, as the rain whispers against the London glass, German engineers are pouring concrete on the beaches of Sicily. They are planting mines in the golden sand. They are aiming artillery from the cliffs. They are moving entire divisions of panzer tanks into the hills. Sicily is not a target. It is a trap. To send the invasion there, as planned, would be a massacre. It would be a beach red with blood. The clock on the wall of Room 13 ticks. The sound is loud in the quiet. It is the only sound. We cannot change the target, Montague says, his voice low, almost part of the rain. And we cannot afford the cost. Then, Cholmondeley replies, his finger tracing the coastline of Spain, we must change the map. You mean, change their reading of the map? Yes, we must make them look away, just for a moment. The plan that rises in the silence of that room is not a new one. It had been floated before, in a dry memo full of wild ideas and dismissed as fantasy. It was called, almost jokingly, Operation Mincemeat. The idea was mad, it was desperate, it was perhaps insane. It was therefore perfect. They would not fight the German armies. They would trick them. They would feed them a lie, so enormous, so detailed, and so convincing that the Germans would move their armies all by themselves. They needed a messenger who could not talk, a messenger who could not be tortured. They needed a dead man. The plan was this: they would find a body. They would dress him as a high-ranking British officer. They would give him a false identity, a false life, and a false secret. Then, they would drop him in the sea off the coast of Spain, carrying a briefcase full of top-secret, forged documents. Those documents would reveal that the Allied invasion was a feint, and that the real target was not Sicily at all. The real target, the lie would say, was Greece. If the Germans believed it, they would move their armies to Greece. Sicily would be left undefended, If they did not believe it, the invasion would be a slaughter. Everything depended on the messenger. He had to be perfect. And so, the search began. Not for a spy, but for a ghost. This was a search that left no paper trail. It was a search conducted in whispers, in phone calls to men who did not give their names. They needed a body, but it could not be just any body. It had to be a man who had died in a specific way, without obvious trauma, preferably from something that could be mistaken for drowning. And most importantly, he had to be a man who would not be missed, a man with no family to come looking for him, no friends to post his picture in the paper, a man who had, in essence, already vanished from the world before he had even left it. After weeks of quiet, grim searching, they found him. He was in the St. Pancras morgue. His name was Glyndwr Michael. He was not a soldier. He was a wanderer, a man without a home, without a job. He had lived in the margins of the city, sleeping in doorways, invisible to the great, grinding machinery of the war. He had died alone in an abandoned warehouse after ingesting rat poison. The poison had been a tragedy, but for Montague and Cholmondeley, it was a miracle. The small amount of poison in his system would produce symptoms, they were told, that were medically indistinguishable from drowning. He was the perfect vessel. In the cold, antiseptic silence of the morgue, Montague stood over the body. This was not an officer. This was a tragedy. A small, forgotten life. He was a man who had died with nothing. No one to mourn him, no one to write his story. Montague placed a hand on the cold metal of the gurney. In life, Glyndwr Michael had been invisible. In death, he would be given a new name, a new life, and a new purpose. He would become the hero who saved the world. The first act of creation was bureaucratic. Papers were signed in secret. Records were altered. The ghost of Glyndwr Michael, the homeless man, was officially erased. And in his place, a new identity was typed onto a crisp military file. He was now, and forever, Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The body of Glyndwr Michael lay in a cold, secret place. It was preserved in ice, in a canister, waiting. But his soul was being born, piece by piece, in the quiet, smoky air of room 13. Ewan Montague understood a deep and simple truth. A man is not his uniform. A man is not his rank. A man is the collection of small, worn, and forgotten things he carries in his pockets. A man is the junk he accumulates. The pocket litter. This next phase of the operation was not espionage. It was an act of pure creation, a form of literary magic. They were not just building a prop. They were writing a novel, and their hero had to be believable. And the first rule of a believable character, Montague and Cholmondeley agreed, is that he must not be perfect. Perfection is always a lie. A real man has troubles. A real man has flaws. A real man has careless. So, the first thing they gave Major William Martin was not a medal. It was a flaw. They procured a small, stiff letter from Lloyd's Bank. The paper was thick. The letterhead embossed. They aged it slightly, folding it and unfolding it, rubbing a corner until it was soft. The letter was addressed to Major Martin, and it was a stern, formal, and deeply disapproving. Notice that his bank account was overdrawn by £79. It was a touch of pure genius. A pristine hero. A perfect officer, doesn't worry about an overdraft. But a real man, a young man in London during the war, a man perhaps spending a bit too much on a girl. He does. This single piece of paper gave him a problem that every person in the German intelligence office, every clerk, every general would instantly understand. Then they added another layer to this small, quiet drama of family life. They created a receipt from a jeweler, a receipt for a new watch, and then a second letter, this one from his father. They wrote it by hand, in the sharp, spiky script of an older, disappointed man. The letter was full of stiff affection, but also concern. It mentioned the carelessness of his son's finances. It mentioned the unnecessary expense of the watch. It mentioned the war, and a father's hope that his son was at least being responsible. In these two letters, they had built a world. A father who worried, a bank that was impatient, and a son, our Major Martin, who was just a little bit reckless, a little bit flawed, a little bit human. But a man with only debts is a sad and lonely character. A young officer, facing a dangerous mission, needed more than that. He needed love. He needed a reason to live, and a reason to be missed. They named her Pam. The name was simple, sweet, and perfectly British. It sounded like home. They found her in their own ranks. A young, pretty secretary working in the intelligence services, Jean Leslie. She had a lovely, open smile, a look of warmth and slight mischief. She agreed to lend her photograph and her identity to the ghost. They took a picture of her, smiling, looking just a little bit lovesick. But a photograph, alone, is just an artifact. It is a fact. It needed a story. And so, they began the heart of the illusion. They wrote the letters. This was the soul of the machine. They sat for hours, in the cold light of that basement room, not as spies, but as poets, as playwrights. They crafted the words of a woman in love. They argued over every sentence, every phrase. The letters could not be too eloquent, too perfect. Pam was not a poet. She was a girl in love. Her words, they decided, should be a little breathless, a little silly, full of small, domestic hopes and quiet, anxious pleas. They wrote of a dance they had missed because he was on duty. They wrote of a small complaint about the rationing, how impossible it was to find good stockings. They wrote of a future that, for the man who would carry these letters, would never arrive. They wrote of a cottage after the war, of a life they would build. They wrote the first letter on simple, cream-colored stationery. But the second, the last one he would receive before his mission, was written on that pale blue, feminine paper that was popular at the time. And then, they performed the final, heartbreaking act of theater. One of the team, Ewan Montague himself, took the final letter, the most passionate one, the one where she begs him to be safe. He sprayed it, very lightly, with a real perfume, a popular scent of the day. He wanted the German officer, who would eventually open it, in a sterile lab in Berlin, to be hit with the sudden, intimate, and unmistakably human smell of a woman's presence. And then, he took an onion from his lunch ration. He cut it, and he dabbed the raw juice just beneath his own eyes. He let a few real, stinging tears fall onto the signature at the bottom of the page. He let them fall onto the ink, smudging the words, "All my love, Pam," just so. As if Pam, the girl who never was, had wept while writing to the man who did not exist. The ghost now had a past. He had a father who worried about him. He had a bank that was angry at him. And he had a fiancée who loved him so much, she cried when she wrote his name. The rest of the items followed, like small, quiet footnotes to this central lie. They gave him a book of matches from the Coterie Club, a popular London night spot. They gave him a stub from a theater ticket, torn in half. The paper was soft, the print slightly faded, as if it had lived in a wallet for weeks. It was for a play, a comedy that had been running in the West End. It was an evening of laughter he had never enjoyed. They gave him a set of keys, the kind that jingle, that feel heavy and important. They opened no doors that mattered. They gave him a small, worn pencil, the end slightly chewed. The kind a man might use to mark a map or write a quick note. They gave him a few coins and a bus ticket, as if he had just been walking the streets of London, a normal man on a normal day, before being called away to his secret mission. Finally, they gathered everything on the desk, under the green lamp, the letters, the keys, the overdraft notice, the photo of the smiling girl. It was the complete life of a man, from his finances to his heart. It was a perfect, intricate, and utterly false mosaic. Major William Martin was no longer just a name on a file. He was real. He was more real, perhaps, than the men who had invented him. He was ready for his final journey. Major William Martin, now complete with a life, a love, and a wallet full of flaws, was ready for his final mission. He was sealed in a custom-built, airtight steel canister. It was a long, narrow cylinder, just large enough for one man. It was painted a dull, military gray. Stenciled on the side, in clean white letters, were the words, "Optical instruments. Handle with care." The lie had to be maintained, even for those who were not meant to see it. This canister was a kind of coffin. It was loaded, in the dead of night, onto a lorry. It moved through the blacked-out streets of London, past the sleeping city, toward the coast of Scotland. There, in the deep, cold waters of the Holy Loch, a submarine was waiting. She was His Majesty's submarine Seraph. The Seraph was a different kind of creature. She was a hunter, a silent shape designed to move beneath the notice of the world. Her crew were young men, trained for tension, trained for the dark. They were told only what they needed to know, that they were carrying a top-secret meteorological device. But they knew, you cannot carry a coffin onto a submarine without the truth whispering through the steel bulkheads. They knew, even if they never spoke it, that they were carrying a dead man. The canister was lashed securely in the torpedo bay, and then, with a low hiss of compressed air and a quiet order, the Seraph slipped her moorings. She moved out of the loch, a long dark shadow in the water, and sank beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. The second act of the story had begun. Inside the submarine, the world shrank. It became a tube of metal, 70 meters long, filled with the smell of diesel oil, unwashed bodies, and stale coffee. There was no day. There was no night. There was only the clock on the wall, and the endless, steady hum of the electric motors. The only light came from the dim, red glow of the bulbs used during patrol, a light designed to preserve the crew's night vision. It cast long, strange shadows on their faces. The sounds were constant, the low thrum of the engines, the ping, ping, ping of the sonar, a metal finger tapping against the dark, listening for echoes, and the constant, quiet drips of condensation as the warm breath of the men inside met the freezing steel of the hull. The crew moved with a practiced economy. You do not waste motion on a submarine. You do not speak in loud voices. You live in a state of permanent, whispered tension, and in the torpedo bay, the canister lay silent. Major Martin was their passenger. He was the quietest, coldest member of the crew. For 10 days, the Seraph moved south, a ghost inside the sea, traveling the long, slow curve toward the coast of Spain. They dodged patrol planes. They dove deep when the sonar pinged an unknown contact. They lived on the edge of discovery, their nerves stretched as taut as the steel plates around them. And finally, on the night of the 30th of April, 1943, they arrived. Lieutenant Jewell, the submarine's commander, brought the Seraph up to periscope depth. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just the dark, calm line of the Spanish coast, about a mile away. The moonlight was bright, a pale, silver wash over the water. This was the place. The port of Huelva. This spot had been chosen with the same agonizing care as Pam's perfume. They knew a fervent and very effective German intelligence agent operated in that town. They were not just dropping the body in the sea, they were delivering it, by hand, to the enemy. Up periscope, the order was given, surface. With a groaning hiss, the ballast tanks emptied. The Seraph broke the surface, the water streaming in white lines off her dark hull. The night air was cold and clean. It smelled of salt and distance. Hatch open, the crew moved quickly, silently, on the wet deck. There were no wasted words. Bring him up. The heavy steel canister was manhandled up through the narrow hatch. It was unsealed. Inside, Major William Martin lay preserved, his crisp Royal Marines uniform immaculate, his face pale and serene in the moonlight. The briefcase, containing the forged letters, the false hopes, the entire weight of the war, was attached to his wrist with a small, discreet chain. They lifted him out, and then something remarkable happened. This was not a job. It was not the deployment of a device. Lieutenant Jewell, the young commander, stood over the body. The crew gathered around him, their faces shadows in the moonlight. They had carried this man, this stranger, across an ocean. They could not let him go without a word. Jewell opened a small waterproof prayer book, and there, on the deck of a submarine, in enemy waters, with the coast of Spain, a dark line in the distance, he began to read. His voice was low, steady, carrying just above the sound of the waves. He read the 39th Psalm, the burial service. Lord, let me know mine end, and the number of my days, that I may be certified how long I have to live." The young sailors stood bare, headed. They were paying their respects, not to the lie, not to the plan, but to the man, to the vessel, to Glyndwr Michael, the wanderer who had died alone, and who was now being given the most extraordinary farewell in the history of the world. "Behold, thou hast made my days as it were a span long, and mine age as even as nothing in respect of thee." When the prayer was finished, there was a moment of perfect silence. Just the moon, the sea, and the dead man. "Gently, men," Jewel said. They lifted Major Martin. They did not drop him. They did not throw him. They lowered him with a strange, solemn tenderness into the water. There was no sound. Only a quiet splash, a small ripple in the silver water. He floated, as they knew he would. The briefcase bobbed beside him. The tide was turning. It was beginning to move, just as they had calculated, toward the shore. "He is not ours to keep," Jewel whispered. The men stared at the floating shape for a long moment. A ghost launched upon the tide, carrying a story that would change the world. Clear the deck. The hatch was sealed. The orders were given. With a final, groaning sigh, the Seraph slipped back into the darkness, leaving Major William Martin alone to begin his final, silent journey toward the land. The Seraph was gone. She had vanished back into the deep, cold Atlantic, a silent witness to a funeral that never happened. Major Martin was alone. He drifted on the gentle, incoming tide, a single, dark shape in the silver moonlight. He was a story, waiting to be read. Back in London, in room 13, the silence was different. It was no longer the silence of creation. It was the silence of a held breath. The map of Europe was still on the wall, but now all eyes were fixed on a single, insignificant point on the coast of Spain. The clock on the wall, the same clock that had ticked through the writing of Pam's love letters, now seemed impossibly loud. Each tick was a hammer blow. Each talk was a question. Ewan Montague and Charles Cholmondeley returned to their desks, but they were not working. They were waiting. They were waiting for a fisherman to wake up. They were waiting for the sun to rise on a Spanish beach. They had launched their ghost. Now, they had to wait to see if he would haunt. The first report came, not by telegraph, but by a slow, agonizingly encoded message. On the morning of the 30th of April, at roughly 7 a.m., a Spanish fisherman, casting his net for sardines, had seen a dark shape floating in the surf. He had rowed closer. He had seen the uniform. He had seen the briefcase chained to the man's wrist. The fisherman had crossed himself. Then, he had towed the body back to the port of Huelva. The first step was complete. The story had found its first reader. Now, the second phase of the wait began, the phase of diplomacy and deception. The body of Major Martin was in the hands of the Spanish authorities. Spain was neutral, but it was a neutrality that leaned heavily toward the Germans. The town of Huelva was crawling with agents of the Abwehr, German military intelligence. The British consul in Huelva was informed. He played his part perfectly. He was furious. He demanded the immediate return of the body. He demanded the return of the briefcase. He made a terrible, loud, and very public fuss about the sensitive diplomatic documents that a clumsy Spanish fisherman had interfered with. He made the briefcase seem impossibly important. In Berlin, the German agent in Huelva, a man named Adolf Kloss, heard the noise. He heard the British consul's rage, and his professional instincts ignited. Anything the British wanted back that badly. The fetcher needed to see first. Back in London, the clock ticked. Tuck. Montague stared at the phone. Cholmondeley drank another cup of cold, bitter tea. They had built the trap. They had baited it with the most beautiful, intricate lie. Would the Germans be smart enough to be fooled? This was the true gamble. They were not betting against German intelligence. They were betting on it. They were betting that the Germans were too smart, too thorough, too logical to believe this could possibly be a trick. A lesser intelligence service might have dismissed it. But Montague was counting on his enemy's arrogance. He was counting on them to believe they had been clever enough to intercept this. The next message came. The Spanish, under polite, but immense German pressure, had agreed to perform an autopsy. This was a moment of quiet panic in room 13. Had they done enough? Was the body of Glyndwr Michael convincing? Had the single small dose of rat poison truly replicated the effects of drowning? What if the Spanish coroner was meticulous? What if he found a detail that didn't fit? A single wrong incision could unravel the entire war. The clock ticked. The rain fell. The room was cold. Then the room was cold. Then the report. The autopsy was brief. The Spanish doctor, working in the heat, with limited supplies, had performed a cursory examination. His conclusion: the man had died of drowning. He had been in the water for several days. The lie had held. The ghost had passed his first test. Now, the briefcase. The Spanish authorities, in a gesture of goodwill, allowed the German agents a moment alone with the documents before they were regretfully returned to the British consul. This was the moment. In a small back room in Hulva, the German agent carefully, expertly, steamed open the envelopes. He photographed every single page. He photographed the cold, official letters between generals. He photographed the angry bank overdraft notice. He photographed the stub of the theater ticket, and he photographed Pam's stained, perfumed love letters. The film was rushed to an airfield. It was flown directly to Berlin. It was placed on the desk of the highest command of the Abwehr. The German analysts went to work. They did not just read the letters. They dissected them. They analyzed the ink. They analyzed the paper. They analyzed the tone. And this is where the genius of Room 13 truly shone. The Germans, in their cold, logical brilliance, found the lie too perfect to be a lie. They noted that the theater ticket stub was from a show that had been playing on the date Major Martin was in London. They noted that the bank overdraft was, in their minds, a classic sign of a British officer's decadent, aristocratic carelessness. It was too real to be fake. And the love letters were the final, clinching masterpiece. They were emotional. They were slightly foolish. They were full of a yearning that no spy, no forger could ever have invented. The smudged ink, the faint scent of perfume. This was not a military document. This was a life. The report was sent up the chain from the Abwehr to the High Command, and from the High Command to the desk of Adolf Hitler himself. Hitler, a man of rigid, unbending instinct, read the report. He saw the proof. He had been waiting for an attack on Greece. He had always felt it would be Greece. This document, stolen by his own brilliant agents, did not just suggest a new reality, it confirmed his deepest suspicions. He was convinced. The order was given, it was sudden, and it was absolute. The discovery of the Englishman's body, the order read, proves the enemy's intention to land in Greece. Panzer divisions were rerouted. Elite troops were moved. Heavy artillery was loaded onto trains, not for Sicily, but for the Greek coastline. The entire weight of the German war machine began to shift, turning like a great, blind giant, away from the real target. The trap had sprung. Back in London, the final, encrypted message arrived in Room 13. It was from their most trusted source, a high-level mole inside German intelligence. It contained only 3 words. Mincemeat, swallowed. Whole, in the basement room. Ewan Montague stood up from his desk. He walked to the window, though there was nothing to see but a wall of sandbags. He did not cheer. He did not smile. He felt a sudden, profound, and ice-cold sense of relief. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a cigarette. He lit it, and for the first time in months, he noticed that his hands, in the small, steady flame of the match, were no longer shaking. The clock in Room 13 was still ticking, but its sound had changed. It was no longer the sound of anxiety. It was the sound of a countdown. The lie was in place. The ghost had done his work. Now, the real armies, the armies of flesh and blood, began to move. In the ports of North Africa, a vast armada, the largest ever assembled, slipped its moorings. Thousands of ships, carrying over 150,000 men, turned their bows north toward the dark, quiet water of the Mediterranean. They were sailing for Sicily. On board those ships, the men were silent. They checked their rifles. They wrote quiet letters home, letters that might never be sent. They listened to the thrum of the engines, a low, steady vibration that they felt in their feet, in their chests. They had been told what to expect. They had been told that the beaches of Sicily were a fortress. They had been shown maps of the German panzer divisions. They had been warned to expect a wall of fire, a sea red with blood. They were prepared for a massacre. They were prepared to die at sunrise. On the night of the 9th of July, 1943, the fleet arrived. The night was still. The sea was calm. In the darkness, the landing craft were lowered. The men climbed down the rope nets, their equipment clinking softly, their faces grim in the faint starlight. The small boats, motors muffled, began their long, slow run toward the shore. This was the moment, the culmination of all the maps, all the plans, all the lies. The men in the boats gripped their rifles, their knuckles white. They braced themselves for the sound that would signal the start of the slaughter. The crump of mortars, the rip of machine guns, the scream of shells. They hit the beach. The flat-bottomed boats ground against the sand. The ramps slammed down. The men ran out, splashing through the shallow surf, their hearts pounding in their throats. They ran onto the sand, screaming their battle cries, expecting to be cut down at any second, and they were met by silence. There was no fire. There were no machine guns. There were no tanks waiting in the hills. The beaches were empty. The men stopped running. They stood, confused, on the dark, empty sand. They looked at each other. They looked up at the cliffs. Nothing. The fortress was a phantom. The trap had no teeth. The only sound was the gentle shush of the waves and the sound of their own breathing. The greatest invasion in history had begun, with a whisper. The Germans, the elite divisions, the panzers, they were all hundreds of miles away. They were sitting in the sun in Greece. They were guarding the wrong country. They were waiting, patiently, for an army that would never come. They were waiting for Major Martin. The lie, born in that cold, damp room in London, had worked. It had worked so perfectly, so completely, that it had hollowed out the enemy's defenses from the inside. The battle for Sicily, which the Allies had feared would be the bloodiest day of the war, became a stunning, swift advance. The ghost of Glyndwr Michael, the man who had died with nothing, had cleared the beaches. Back in London, the news came. Landing successful, resistance minimal. In room 13, Montague and Cholmondeley read the report. Minimal, Montague said, tasting the word. He thought of the men on those boats. He thought of the thousands who are now walking inland, alive, who should have been dead. He thought of the German armies in Greece, staring at an empty sea. And he thought of a single, cold body floating in the moonlight, carrying a briefcase full of love letters. The victory was not loud. It was not a trumpet blast. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of a perfect, intricate machine that had turned exactly as planned. It was the sound of the clock on the wall, still ticking, marking the time in a world that had just been saved. The war ended. The great, grinding noise of it finally shuddered to a halt. The maps were redrawn. The armies went home. The world began the slow, difficult work of forgetting, and the even harder work of remembering. In London, room 13 was cleared out. The maps were taken down from the walls, leaving pale rectangles where the concrete had not faded. The teacups were washed. The files were locked away in deep, cold archives, stamped with the word secret in red ink that would hold its color for 50 years. The architects of the lie, Montague and Cholmondeley, returned to their quiet, civilian lives. They walked the streets of a peaceful London, carrying a story they could not tell. But what of the hero? What of the ghost? Major William Martin, the man who never was, remained on duty. He lay in a small, quiet cemetery in the town of Hilvalva, Spain. The sun warmed the stone above him. His grave was tended by the locals, a small point of British pride in a foreign land. He was, for all the world to see, a hero, a man who had died in service to his country. The lie was complete. It was carved in granite. The tombstone read, William Martin, born the 29th of March 1907, died the 24th of April 1943. Beloved son of John Glyndwr Martin and the late Antonia Martin Dulce, et decorum est pro patria more. They had even given him a fictional father, borrowing the homeless man's own middle name, Glyndwr, as a final, secret tribute. A whisper of truth hidden in plain sight. For decades, the story remained a secret. But the most beautiful stories, even the secret ones, have a way of demanding an ending. Years after the war, a woman traveled to that small cemetery in Huelva. She was no longer the young, smiling secretary from the photograph. She was older, her face lined with a life that had been lived. It was Joan Leslie, the woman who had played Pam. She had lent her face, her smile, to a ghost. She had been the beloved fiancée in the letters that had fooled Hitler. She traveled alone. She found the grave, standing quietly in the Spanish sunlight. She stood there for a long time, looking at the name of the man she had never met, but whose life had been so strangely, secretly, tied to her own. He was her fictional fiancé. She was his real and only mourner. She placed a small bouquet of flowers on the stone. It was a final, quiet act of truth. A real woman shedding a real tear for a fabricated man. The lie and the truth in that small cemetery had finally become the same thing. And what of the man who was? What of Glyndwr Michael, the wanderer, the man who had died alone in a cold warehouse? In 1996, long after the architects of the lie had passed away, the British government finally, gently, lifted the veil of secrecy. They admitted the truth of Operation Mincemeat, and they added a new inscription to the bottom of that gravestone in Huelva. It reads, Glyndwr Michael served as Major William Martin. R.M. the Ghost finally had his name back. The wanderer who had died invisible was now and forever acknowledged by history. The two men, the real and the imaginary, were finally at rest, together, under the same stone. The story was complete. Sometimes, the most profound truths are built upon a foundation of perfect, intricate lies. Sometimes, a life that was invisible can cast the longest shadow of all. And sometimes, a story, born in a cold room full of maps and quiet desperation, can be so powerful that it saves the world, long before it is ever told. The rain has stopped falling over London. The clock in room 13 is silent. The file is closed. The story is over. And now, the night is quiet. The work is done. It is time to sleep.